If you went into a coma in the year 2002 and woke up 20 years later in 2022, seeing Chechen fighters holding up the Russian tricolor would be a puzzling sight. In 2002, Furio was still on The Sopranos, and the Russian Federation was off the heels of two bloody wars in Chechnya. The point being, a lot has changed. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union and foundation of the current Russian Federation, Chechens would be the scourge of Russian troops and for years conduct a guerrilla war. But today, Chechens are now employed as Russia's shock troops in Ukraine. How exactly did this transpire? How did Chechens go from insurgents to shock troops? To start, the legacy of Chechen insurgents fighting Russians is more or less hundreds of years old. For basically the first half of the 19th century, Russia and various North Caucasian people, including the Chechens, were in constant conflict. A low-level insurgency would continue with flare-ups during the Russian Civil War and especially during World War II. Post-World War II, while there would still be tensions, Soviet Chechnya would be fairly peaceful. Just like Furio on The Sopranos, the peace would not last. In 1989, the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence would begin to implode. Like so many other constituencies of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Chechnya would move toward independence. On September 6, 1991, the recently formed All-National Congress of the Chechen People stormed the Supreme Soviet in Grozny, which resulted in the death of the head of Grozny's Communist Party. On November 1st, 1991, Chechnya formally declared independence from the USSR, who was basically powerless to stop them, and the head of the Congress of the Chechen People, Dzhokhar Dudayev, was elected president. Chechnya would quickly devolve into the classic post-Soviet state trap of internal ethnic conflict between the English peoples within Chechnya and the Chechens themselves. In a kinda troll move, the English would join the Russian Federation to spite the Chechens.
This has all been a trick. You have been trolled.
The English would then get into another ethnic conflict with the Ossetians in 1992, and the first sizable amount of Russian troops began to appear on the English-Chechen border to prevent arms shipments. An important thing to note here is Russia did not recognize the independence of Chechnya, and there was a policy in Chechnya where there was no extradition treaty to states that did not recognize their independence. So Chechnya was becoming a hotbed of criminal activity and a safe haven for criminals of the post-Soviet world. Russia sought initially to dismantle the Chechen state clandestinely by funding the opposition of President Dudayev, which at this point was sizable as he had quickly become dictatorial. There were a couple failed Russian-backed attacks on Grozny by Dudayev's opposition in fall of 1994, and on December 1st, Boris Yeltsin had had enough and openly committed Russian forces to an attack on Grozny. The First Chechen War had begun. I won't go into too much detail on the war itself because that's not what this video is supposed to be about. But in summary, the Russians had early success in taking Grozny with heavy losses and massive damage to the city. The Russians later got bogged down in the countryside, and eventually the Chechens were able to regroup and re-infiltrate the city, causing extreme losses in the summer of 1996. Hold up! If you're liking this video so far, subscribe so you can consume more of my content. Thank you. Oh, sorry, real quick. I forgot to mention the Chechen president, Dudayev, was killed by a Russian airstrike when his phone was backtraced during a call.
I know who it's coming from, because I backtraced it!
He should have acted like a New Jersey mobster and only talked in person to associates next to a loud washing machine. So, of course, The Sopranos was still on TV when this war was going on. So, in the hypotheticals of infinite universes, there is a universe in which James Gandolfini, in character as Tony Soprano, converts to Islam and becomes the president of Chechnya. Fighting would subside on August 30th, 1996, when both sides agreed to a ceasefire and the demilitarization of Grozny. The important takeaway here is that Chechnya sort of got Russia to treat Chechnya as an independent country. Russian troops were gone, and the Russian government made formal economic agreements with the Chechen government. An important factor of that war that I haven't mentioned yet is the role of Islam. Of course, the overwhelming majority of Chechens are Muslim, and most Russians are not. Many Islamic leaders declared jihad on Russia, and Islamic militants played a large role in the fighting. Many international Islamic militants answered this call to jihad, and, well, basically, people were starting to run with this jihad thing. The complete collapse of the Chechen economy and ineptitude of the government during this peace led again to criminals, warlords, and extremists gaining power, even to the point where concessions were made by the Chechen government to Islamists to incorporate some aspects of Sharia into law. In August of 1999, Islamic fighters from Chechnya invaded Dagestan, numbering in the thousands. Dagestan, of course, like Chechnya, is a majority Muslim region, but unlike Chechnya, did not gain independence in the Soviet collapse and was still part of the Russian Federation. Yeah, so basically a sort of ISIS-style group ruined it for everyone because, what are the Russians gonna do, just let them invade? Well, this is the start of the Second Chechen War. The Russians pushed the Chechen Islamic fighters back quickly and occupied some territory within Chechnya itself to act as a security buffer. This holding a security buffer zone idea was quickly scrapped in favor of an assault on Grozny. The Russian attack on Grozny that started in late December of 1999 was immensely successful. The city was taken with less than 400 Russian servicemen killed, and a formal independent government of Chechnya was no more. But much like the First War, Russia struggled in the countryside and began to suffer mounting losses from insurgent tactics. I want to quickly introduce a man who had been in important positions of power this whole time, but by the year 2000 was the guy in Russia. Vladimir Putin had been a protege of Yeltsin through the 90s, and he would be appointed prime minister in 1999. When Yeltsin suddenly resigned on Y2K, Putin became acting president of Russia and would win the snap presidential elections of 2000. Most of this video has basically been a history, an abridged history, of the Chechen Wars, but I promise I'm tying it into the title, and with Putin now at the head of Russia, we have the first movement toward a pro-Russian Chechnya, a new face. A lot of issues of the early Russian Federation would be placed on Yeltsin, deservedly or not. From the Chechen perspective, a new leader of Russia does not have as much baggage as his predecessor. In June of 2000, an important decision was made by Putin when he appointed a Chechen rebel in charge of the Chechen government, Ahmad Kadyrov. Yes, Ahmad Kadyrov was an Islamist, but unlike some other Chechen rebel groups, he was not a Wahhabist. He fought against Russia in the First Chechen War and considered it a war for Chechen independence first and any sort of Islamic reasons second. The Wahhabi rebel factions wanted to establish a caliphate for global jihad, whereas Ahmad just wanted an independent Muslim Chechnya. As a result of this divide, he instead sought reconciliation with Russia and autonomy for Chechnya. It turns out his view on things was widespread enough, and with a hero of the First Chechen War now in charge of a highly autonomous Chechen Republic as a subject of the Russian Federation, the anti-Russian insurgency began to decline. While the insurgency was certainly on the downswing, unfortunately for Ahmad, it wasn't completely gone, and he was assassinated in a bombing on May 9th, 2004. Upon the assassination of Ahmad, his son Ramzan Kadyrov, himself an anti-Russian fighter of the First Chechen War, was appointed as Deputy Prime Minister of Chechnya. In 2006, Ramzan was appointed prime minister by Chechen President Alu Alkanov. Then later, when Alkanov himself was appointed deputy justice minister of the Russian Federation, Putin appointed Ramzan to be president of Chechnya. This is already running longer than I wanted to, but I think the history is important and required to understand the points I'm going to make to answer my initial thesis here. I think with what we know now, we can construct very clear reasons as to why Chechnya is now a loyal subject to Russia, with men coming from there being some of the most fanatic fighting for Russia in Ukraine right now. The current ruling class of Chechnya was formed by a natural alliance between Russia and more moderate Chechen Muslims who had become wary of Wahhabist influence in Chechnya. The Kadyrov family was uplifted to rule by Putin, which would foster personal loyalty. Russia doesn't seem to have an issue with Chechnya having elements of Islamic law, which is a complete 180 from Soviet times when religion would often be cracked down on. The Kadyrovs have a lot of influence, support, and popularity in Chechnya itself, which would trickle up to Putin in the form of loyal men that follow Ramzan's orders. Russia granted amnesty to former Chechen fighters and funneled money into restoring many destroyed areas of Chechnya. And finally, integration of Chechen politicians into high levels of the Russian federal government. Of course, these are my observations as an outsider. I've not talked to a Chechen or a Russian and asked them their reasons or why they do or do not support a certain thing. I'm working off research I've done myself on something that may be a mystery to the English-speaking world, who, before 2022, only heard about Chechens when they were enemies of Russia. Especially if you are a Sopranos enjoyer, and remember the Russian guy that killed
16 Chechen rebels, 16 Czechoslovakians.
I make my case here and now that Sopranos watchers are the most intelligent and educated people in the world. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, give it a comment, maybe even a little subscribe action. I'll see you soon with another one.